The sun rose steadily over the small suburban neighborhood, casting a warm glow on the familiar streets. It was a crisp morning, the kind where everything seemed in its place. Among the quiet hustle of commuters and the soft murmur of the day beginning, a confident woman named Eleanor Parker stepped out of her car in the parking lot of her local bank. She wasn't rushing. There was no urgency in her stride, only the ease of routine. Her tailored jacket fit perfectly over her shoulders, and her briefcase swung slightly at her side. Eleanor was a businesswoman, and this, depositing her check, was just one task among many on her packed schedule. Inside the bank, the day had already begun for its manager, Greg Benson. At his desk near the far end of the floor, he glanced at his watch between calls and emails, ensuring that operations ran smoothly. Greg had been in this job for over a decade, and it showed in his demeanor. He knew the policies, the protocols, and, as he often liked to remind his staff, he knew people. Eleanor walked into the bank with a calm, practiced confidence. She approached the counter where a young teller greeted her with a polite smile. Eleanor placed the check in front of the teller, who blinked twice when she saw the amount. It wasn't every day that someone came in with a check worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The teller, visibly unsure, quickly called for Greg. From his desk, he rose with a slow deliberation, adjusting his suit as he walked over. Greg's eyes scanned Eleanor for just a moment, too long for it to go unnoticed, and then he turned his attention to the check. Greg didn't smile. He held the check between his fingers, tilting it slightly under the light as if expecting to find something wrong. "That's quite a lot of money," he said, his tone more questioning than conversational. Eleanor stood silently, waiting for him to finish his assessment, her expression calm but firm. Greg's gaze shifted back to Eleanor. His voice was careful but carried a trace of condescension. "Where did you get this check?" he asked. The words were pointed, leaving no doubt about the underlying suspicion. Eleanor's response was measured, "From my business. I'm depositing it today." The exchange caught the attention of nearby customers. Whispers began to ripple across the room as Greg set the check down and called for verification. Eleanor said nothing, her hands resting lightly on the counter. The tension was thick, though no one said it outright. It was the kind of moment that stayed quiet but said everything. What should have been a routine transaction was now something else entirely. But Eleanor wasn't new to moments like this. She'd seen them before, and she knew what they meant. As Greg stepped away, she straightened her shoulders and prepared herself for whatever came next. For Eleanor, it was just a trip to the bank. For Greg, it was a decision that would change everything. Greg returned to the counter moments later, his expression unreadable but his tone firm. "We'll need to hold the check for verification," he said flatly. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her hand still resting calmly on the counter. "And why is that?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying the weight of someone who had been here before. Greg avoided direct eye contact as he spoke. "It's standard policy for large checks." The room around them seemed to quiet, the usual hum of the bank's operations slowing as customers began to pay attention to the interaction. Eleanor's response was quick and pointed, "I've deposited checks like this here before, without any issues." Greg hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, his words careful but still laced with an air of authority. "Well, we have protocols to follow, especially for amounts like this. I'm sure you understand." Eleanor held his gaze now, unwavering. "No, I don't," she said plainly. The silence that followed was almost tangible. Greg shifted uncomfortably, looking briefly toward the line of customers that had grown behind Eleanor. He motioned for a colleague to step in. "Security," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Eleanor to hear. She didn't flinch. The tension in the room grew as the bank's security guard approached the counter. He was a tall man, imposing but unsure of the situation he was walking into. Greg turned to him and spoke in a low voice, though not low enough to prevent others from hearing. Please escort this woman to the waiting area while we verify the check. The word verify hung in the air, its implication clear to everyone present. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying Greg's face. Am I being asked to leave? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Greg cleared his throat. It's just policy, he repeated, as if the words alone could absolve him of any wrongdoing. Eleanor took a deep breath. Policy for who? She asked pointedly. The guard looked from Eleanor to Greg, his hesitation evident. For a moment, it seemed he might step back, but Greg's stern glance pushed him forward. Ma'am, if you could just wait over here, the guard said, his tone softer than Greg's but still insistent. Eleanor didn't move. Let me ask you something, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the uneasy quiet. If I didn't look like I do, would you still be holding this check? Greg stiffened at the question, his face flushing slightly. He didn't respond. Around them, customers shifted uncomfortably, some whispering to each other, others pretending not to notice. Finally, Eleanor stepped back, raising her hands slightly in a gesture of reluctant compliance. Fine, she said, her tone carrying a mix of exasperation and resolve. She walked to the waiting area, the guard trailing a few steps behind her. As she sat down, she noticed the glances from the other customers, some sympathetic, others curious, and a few that seemed almost smug. Greg returned to his desk, the check still in his hand. He placed a call to the bank's verification department, his voice low but his demeanor tense. Eleanor sat quietly, watching him from across the room. She didn't fidget or check her phone. She simply waited, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. As the minutes dragged on, Eleanor thought back to the countless times she had been in situations like this. Moments where her success, her intelligence, and her dignity had been questioned, not because of her actions, but because of who she was. This moment was no different, and yet, it was entirely unacceptable. At the counter, the young teller exchanged a glance with a colleague, her discomfort evident. I don't think there's anything wrong with the check, the teller whispered. Her colleague shrugged, his eyes darting nervously toward Greg. It's not up to us, he muttered. Greg hung up the phone after what seemed like an eternity. He walked back toward Eleanor, the check still clutched in his hand. His expression hadn't softened. We're going to need additional documentation, he said, stopping just short of where she sat. Eleanor looked up at him, her face calm but her eyes sharp. You have everything you need, she said. Greg hesitated but didn't back down. If you can't provide what we're asking for, we'll have to flag this check. The word flag seemed to echo in the quiet of the waiting area. Eleanor stood, meeting Greg's gaze once more. Do what you have to do, she said evenly. But don't think for a second that I'm walking away from this. Greg stepped back slightly, his confidence wavering for the first time. He turned and walked briskly to his office, shutting the door behind him. Eleanor remained standing, her presence commanding even in the face of blatant injustice. Around her, the murmurs in the room grew louder, the tension building with every passing second. For Greg, this was a matter of protocol. For Eleanor, it was a matter of principle. And neither of them was willing to back down. The door to Greg's office remained shut as Eleanor stood in the middle of the waiting area. The minutes dragged into an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers or the muted whispers of customers who were still trying to piece together what was happening. Eleanor remained composed, but there was no mistaking the air of tension that hung around her like a heavy cloud. Inside the office, Greg leaned back in his chair, the check still on his desk. His fingers tapped nervously on the armrest as he dialed yet another number. He needed confirmation, something, anything, that would justify the growing storm brewing outside his door. But the person on the other end of the line seemed to be giving him answers he didn't want to hear. When Greg finally stepped out of his office, he was greeted by a scene that was far from the orderly bank he was used to. Customers were now openly watching Eleanor, their curiosity and unease palpable. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with suspicion. Greg cleared his throat, trying to reassert his authority over the room. He motioned for Eleanor to return to the counter. Eleanor walked back, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. She stopped just short of the counter, looking Greg directly in the eye. "So," she said, her voice calm but unyielding, "what's the issue now?" Greg's tone remained measured, but there was a clear edge to his words. "We're still waiting for full verification, but as I mentioned earlier, we'll need additional documentation from you." Eleanor's lips tightened slightly, but she didn't raise her voice. "I've already told you," she said, "you have everything you need." The exchange wasn't just a conversation anymore, it was a spectacle. Customers and staff alike were glued to the unfolding drama, their eyes darting between Greg and Eleanor like spectators at a match. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Greg leaned forward, lowering his voice in a way that only made his words carry further. "Look," he said, "I'm just doing my job. If you can't provide the documentation we've asked for, then I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do for you." Eleanor didn't flinch. Her voice was steady as she replied, "And what exactly do you think you're protecting this bank from? A legitimate check, signed by a legitimate account holder, deposited by a legitimate business owner?" Greg opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice from the line of customers cut through the tension. "She's right," an older man said, stepping forward slightly. "I've been coming to this bank for years, and I've never seen anyone treated like this over a check." The murmur of agreement from the crowd was faint but undeniable. Greg's jaw tightened as he turned toward the man. "This is a private matter," he said, his tone sharper now. But the man didn't back down. "It doesn't look very private from here," he said, gesturing toward the growing audience. Greg turned back to Eleanor, his frustration now plainly visible. The humiliation wasn't just Eleanor's anymore, it was Greg's. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were questioning, whispering, and casting their own silent judgments. And Eleanor, standing tall and unshaken, refused to let Greg off the hook. "You've put me through this entire process for what?" she asked, her voice cutting through the room. "Because you saw someone who doesn't look like they belong here?" Greg stepped back, his face flushed. "That's not what this is about," he said defensively. But his words didn't carry the weight they once did. The room's atmosphere had shifted, and Greg was losing control of the narrative. Just then, the young teller who had initially handled Eleanor's check stepped forward, her voice hesitant but firm. "Mr. Benson," she said, addressing Greg by his title, "I don't think there's anything wrong with the check. I've verified the signature and the account, it's all in order." Greg turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. "It's not your call," he snapped. But the teller didn't retreat. "Maybe it should be," she said softly. The room seemed to shift again, this time in Eleanor's favor. The customers in line murmured louder now, their whispers carrying a mix of support and indignation. One woman leaned over to another and said, "If they're treating her like this, imagine what they'd do to us." Greg's composure was cracking. He turned back to Eleanor, grasping for some semblance of control. "I'll need to escalate this to corporate," he said finally, his voice lacking the confidence it had earlier. Eleanor crossed her arms. "Go ahead," she said, her voice steady. "And while you're at it, tell them exactly what you've done here today." Greg froze for a moment, his expression unreadable. He knew he was on shaky ground, but his pride wouldn't let him concede. Instead, he turned sharply and walked back into his office, slamming the door behind him. The crowd in the bank grew restless, their murmurs now tinged with frustration and anger. Eleanor remained standing at the counter, her calm demeanor masking the fire that burned inside her. She had no intention of leaving, no matter how long Greg tried to stall. This wasn't just about a check anymore, it was about something much bigger. As Greg sat in his office, pacing and making frantic calls, Eleanor stood firm in the waiting area, her presence commanding the room. The humiliation Greg had tried to impose on her was now his own to bear. And outside that office door, a reckoning was waiting. Eleanor stood still, her hands resting on the counter. She wasn't pacing, she wasn't fidgeting, and she certainly wasn't leaving. Around her, the room had quieted again, the growing tension now replaced by an almost electric anticipation. Everyone knew something was about to happen. What they didn't know was just how significant it would be. Inside his office, Greg was on the phone, his voice low but frantic. "I just need confirmation," he insisted to the person on the other end of the line. "Yes, I know it's a legitimate account, but the amount, it's unusually high. We can't take any chances here." The silence on the other end of the call stretched too long, and Greg's patience wore thin. "Can you escalate this? I need an answer now." But what Greg didn't know was that Eleanor wasn't just standing idly by. While he had been fumbling through calls and excuses, Eleanor had already taken her own action. She reached into her briefcase and retrieved her phone. With a few quick taps, she dialed a number she knew by heart. When the voice on the other end answered, her response was calm but direct. "It's happening again," she said simply. "At the Elm Street branch." The person on the other end didn't need further explanation. They assured her that everything would be handled and ended the call. Eleanor placed her phone back in her bag and resumed her stance at the counter, her composure unshaken. The other customers noticed this shift. She wasn't just waiting, she was preparing. 15 minutes passed. Greg emerged from his office once again, but this time, his face was pale, his confidence thoroughly rattled. He walked briskly toward the counter, holding the check like it was a ticking time bomb. "Ms. Parker," he began, his voice noticeably less steady than before, "I've spoken with corporate, and they're reviewing the situation." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Reviewing?" she repeated. "What exactly are they reviewing?" Greg faltered. "We just need to ensure that all the proper procedures are followed," he said, though even he didn't seem to believe his own words. Eleanor leaned slightly forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Greg," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "do you even know who I am?" Greg froze, visibly thrown by the question. He stammered for a moment before saying, "Well, I know you're a business owner. And, clearly, you've done well for yourself." His words hung awkwardly in the air, their thinly veiled condescension impossible to miss. Eleanor didn't blink. "You don't know who I am," she said, her tone sharper now. "But you're about to." Before Greg could respond, the bank's front doors swung open, and a group of sharply dressed individuals walked in, their presence commanding immediate attention. At the front was a woman in a tailored suit, her expression one of quiet authority. She walked directly toward Eleanor, extending a hand. "Ms. Parker," she said warmly, "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. I assure you, this will be resolved immediately." Greg's face turned ashen as he watched the scene unfold. He recognized the woman. She was a regional executive from corporate, someone far above his own rank. The realization hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a customer. This wasn't just another check. Eleanor Parker was someone far more significant than he had imagined. The executive turned toward Greg, her expression hardening. "Mr. Benson," she said, her voice sharp and professional, "can you explain why one of our most prominent account holders has been subjected to such an experience at your branch?" Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence was deafening. Eleanor didn't wait for Greg to recover. She addressed the room, her voice steady and clear. "Let me make this simple for everyone," she began. "I am the majority shareholder of this bank. I own not just this branch but several others in this region. The check you've been questioning so thoroughly is from one of my businesses." Her words hit the room like a thunderclap. The customers stared in stunned silence, their earlier curiosity replaced by disbelief. Greg's face turned red as he struggled to process what he'd just heard. You own," he began, but Eleanor cut him off. "Yes, Greg," she said, her tone sharp, I own the bank. And today, you've not only embarrassed yourself, you've embarrassed this institution. The executive stepped forward again, taking the check from Greg's trembling hands. Ms. Parker, she said, her tone apologetic, I'll process this personally, and I assure you, this will not happen again. Eleanor nodded but didn't soften. See that it doesn't, she replied. Greg looked as if he might collapse under the weight of his humiliation. He tried to stammer an apology, but Eleanor silenced him with a glance. Save it, she said simply. Your actions today speak louder than any apology ever could. For Greg, the truth was a devastating blow. For Eleanor, it was a long overdue moment of justice. But for everyone in that room, it was a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Eleanor stood at the counter, her presence commanding the room. The executive remained at her side, her hands clasped tightly around the check, as Greg hovered awkwardly nearby, unsure of where to place himself. The atmosphere in the bank had shifted entirely. Where there had been whispers of doubt and suspicion, there was now a heavy silence of realization and shame. I'm curious, Greg, Eleanor said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Her voice was calm, measured, but every word cut deep. What exactly was your thought process here? When you looked at me, standing in front of you with a legitimate check from a legitimate account, what made you decide that I didn't belong? Greg opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor held up a hand. No, actually, she said, I don't want to hear whatever excuse you've come up with. Because it doesn't matter. What matters is that you looked at me and saw something you didn't trust. And that's not about policy, that's about you. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Greg swallowed hard, his face pale, but he didn't argue. The executive shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to navigate the unfolding confrontation. The rest of the room was frozen, every eye on Eleanor as she delivered the truth that so many of them needed to hear. Eleanor took a step forward, her gaze never leaving Greg's. You could have asked me a question, she continued. You could have done your due diligence without humiliating me, without dragging this entire room into your assumptions about who I am and what I deserve. Her voice grew stronger with each word. But you didn't. You chose to treat me like I didn't belong, and that's not just unprofessional, it's unacceptable. Greg stammered, his words barely audible. I was just trying to follow protocol, he managed weakly. Eleanor shook her head, her expression unrelenting. No, she said firmly, you weren't. Protocol is about the process, not the person. What you did was personal. The executive stepped in then, her voice low and apologetic. Ms. Parker, she began, I want to assure you that Mr. Benson's actions do not reflect the values of this institution. We take these matters very seriously, and will be conducting a thorough review of his conduct. Eleanor turned to her, her expression softening slightly but her tone still resolute. Good, she said. Because this isn't just about me. It's about every person who walks into this bank and deserves to be treated with respect. The executive nodded, her face somber. You have my word, she said quietly. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She turned back to Greg, her gaze sharp once more. I hope you understand what's happening here, she said. This isn't just a bad day at work for you. This is a reckoning. Because people like you have been getting away with this for far too long. Greg's face was a study in discomfort, an awkward mix of shame and defensiveness. But he didn't say anything. There was nothing he could say. The room was entirely against him now, the silent judgment of the customers and staff bearing down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. One by one, the customers in the bank began to speak up. An older woman in the corner said quietly, she's right. I've seen this kind of thing happen before, and it's not fair. Another man near the front nodded in agreement. We all know why she was treated like that, he said bluntly. It's not right. The murmurs grew louder, the voices of support for Eleanor swelling into a chorus that Greg couldn't ignore. He looked around, his eyes darting from face to face, but he found no sympathy. He was alone in his failure, his bias laid bare for all to see. Eleanor took a deep breath, her composure as steady as ever. "I don't want an apology," she said finally, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "What I want is change. Because if this is how you treat one person, how many others have you done this to? How many more will you do this to if nothing changes?" Her words were pointed, her conviction unshakable. The executive nodded again, her expression resolute. "We'll be taking immediate action," she promised. "And I'll be personally overseeing the implementation of mandatory anti-bias training for all staff at every branch." Eleanor nodded in response, but her gaze didn't waver from Greg. "I hope you're paying attention," she said to him. "Because this is the last time you'll treat anyone like this without consequences." Greg looked down at his feet, his face red with humiliation. The executive turned to the rest of the staff, her voice firm. "Everyone, back to work," she said. The bank began to hum with activity once more, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The customers who had been watching now looked at Eleanor with admiration and respect. She had stood her ground, and she had won. As Eleanor walked out of the bank, her head held high, Greg remained behind the counter, his world turned upside down. For her, this was just another fight in a long line of battles. For him, it was a moment he would never forget. And for everyone who had witnessed it, it was a powerful reminder of what happens when justice finally takes a stand. Eleanor walked out of the bank, her step steady, her confidence unshaken. The sunlight hit her face as she reached the parking lot, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction, proof that standing firm in the face of injustice still mattered. Behind her, the bank's doors closed, sealing Greg Benson inside. For him, the world had changed in a single hour. He remained at his desk, the echoes of Eleanor's words still ringing in his ears. The executive's stern instructions loomed over him, and he knew his position was anything but secure. The weight of his actions, or lack of understanding, was a burden he would carry long after this day. For the customers who had been present, the event left a mark. Conversations spilled out into the street as they left the bank, each person reflecting on what they had seen. Some admitted their own discomfort with the way Eleanor had been treated, while others expressed admiration for her unwavering stance. But no one could deny the impact of what they had witnessed. One woman, a middle-aged teacher, paused outside the bank, her face pensive. "I've seen things like this happen before," she said quietly to a fellow customer. "But I've never seen anyone handle it the way she did." She made him face it. The man beside her nodded, his arms crossed. "It's about time someone did," he replied. "Maybe this will make them think twice." Meanwhile, Eleanor returned to her office, a sleek and modern space overlooking the city. She set her briefcase down on her desk and took a deep breath. Her assistant peeked in, concern etched on her face. "Everything okay?" she asked. Eleanor nodded, her expression calm but firm. "Handled," she replied simply. She sat down, her mind briefly replaying the events of the morning. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of treatment, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But something about this incident felt different. Perhaps it was the way the customers in the bank had spoken up. Or perhaps it was the sight of Greg, finally forced to confront the consequences of his assumptions. Either way, Eleanor felt a sense of progress, however small. The corporate executive who had intervened wasted no time implementing the changes Eleanor had demanded. Within days, a memo went out to all staff, outlining the mandatory anti-bias training that would be rolled out across every branch. For Greg, the consequences were more immediate. He was placed on leave pending an investigation, and while the outcome was uncertain, the message was clear: the institution would no longer tolerate actions that undermined its values. For Eleanor, it wasn't about punishing Greg or seeking personal vengeance. It was about setting an example, not just for him, but for everyone who had been in that room. People need to see what's possible, she told a close friend later. If you don't stand up, nothing changes. The ripples of Eleanor's stand extended far beyond that small suburban branch. Word spread quickly, not just within the bank but across the local community. Stories about the woman who owned the bank began to circulate, each retelling a testament to her strength and resilience. People who had felt powerless in similar situations found inspiration in her actions, and conversations about fairness and bias started to take root in places where they had long been ignored. One man who had been in line that day recounted the event to his family over dinner. "I'll never forget the way she looked at him," he said. "It wasn't anger. It was something stronger, like she knew she was right, and nothing he said could change that." His teenage daughter listened intently, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "I want to be like that," she said quietly. "I want to stand up for myself like she did." For Eleanor, life returned to its usual rhythm, though the events of that day stayed with her. Every so often, she would think back to the faces in the bank, the silent supporters, the hesitant bystanders, and, of course, Greg. She hoped they had learned something, not just about her, but about themselves. As she looked out the window of her office one evening, the city lights twinkling below, she felt a quiet resolve. She wasn't just running a business, she was breaking barriers, reshaping perceptions, and creating a world where stories like hers might one day be unnecessary. Until then, she would keep moving forward, one step at a time. Eleanor's story was more than just a moment of justice. It was a reminder of the power of perseverance, the importance of standing firm, and the impact one person can have when they refuse to back down. For those who witnessed it, and for those who heard about it after, it was a lesson that would linger long after the bank's doors had closed. And for Eleanor, it was simply another step in a journey that was far from over.